All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar. My name is Daniela Labate, and I work for NIAPRIS. NIAPRIS, as you may or may not know, is one of MCTAC's training partners, and we actually coordinate the MCTAC Plus assignments for MCTAC, and we'll get to what that is in just a few slides if you're not familiar with MCTAC Plus. I want to welcome everyone to today's webinar. Today's webinar is part one in our series on collaboration. And we are lucky enough to have Brett Friedman with us today from Ropes & Gray here in New York City. And our topic today is ensuring that your goals align with a potential partner. To move from an internal discussion into a memorandum of understanding. Before we get into the material for today's webinar, we have just a few quick housekeepings to go over. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the slides and recording will be posted on the MCTAC website. I do want to encourage all of our participants to utilize the chat box feature to type in your questions throughout the presentation, and we have set aside some time at the end to answer your questions. Please chat your questions into all panelists so that we're sure that we get to see everyone's questions as they're coming in. As I said, we're going to attempt to answer as many questions as we have time for today. We have set aside some time at the end, but if for some reason we have not been able to answer your question or we didn't get to your question today, we'll be sure to answer your question via email after today's webinar. For those of you who may be new to MCTAC, MCTAC is a training, consultation, and educational resource center that offers resources to all mental health and substance use disorder providers in New York State, and MCTAC's overall goal is to prepare and assist providers with the transition to Medicaid managed care. Here we are, TAC and MCTAC partner slide, so you can see everyone that's involved in the trainings with MCTAC. Here is the partner slide for MCTAC Plus, and the partners for MCTAC Plus provide individualized and hands-on training and technical assistance to behavioral health providers throughout New York State on the successful transition to managed Medicaid. I also want to quickly remind folks who are listening today to register at ctacny.org for part 2 of our series on collaboration, and that's going to take place on March 1st from noon to 1 p.m. That webinar is going to discuss strategy and due diligence when forming partnerships and collaborations, and we have Joe Naughton-Travers from Open Minds who's going to do that webinar for us. So real quick, just one more time, please don't be shy and feel free to use that chat box feature. Without further ado, I am going to go ahead and pass things over to Brett Friedman, who is going to print for us today from Ropes & Gray here in New York City. So thank you so much, Brett. I'm going to pass that ball over to you so you can control the slides, and we can get started.
And thank you for the introduction, Daniela. When MCTAC asked me to do this presentation, I was very excited because I would say this presentation is not inherently legal. I would say it's more procedural in terms of starting from the beginning of your exploration of a strategic partnership. I get these questions a lot, which is, we think we need to do something. How do we go about doing it? So in light of that ask and the process that healthcare organizations, whether for-profit or not-for-profit, should follow, we created an agenda that's in 4 parts. We'll introduce the reimbursement landscape that is driving a lot of the need to strategically collaborate or partner. Discuss the planning process, which is how do you get from an idea of a need to collaborate to what we call an MOU or a memorandum of understanding. That's essentially the first document you develop in memorializing your deal, your partnership, your affiliation with a strategic partner. We'll go through very briefly different model types of strategic collaboration, and then we'll discuss in detail what we typically see in an MOU, how you negotiate it, and what the conditions are. The idea of this presentation is this is going to get you from the inception of an idea to something concrete on paper that's signed by both parties that really maps out the roadmap for doing what you'll hear in the next in this part, due diligence, and getting to a definitive agreement that can move to closing. Moving on to slide 8, 9, again, this is just a very brief intro. You've probably heard this many times before, but what are the changes in the reimbursement landscape that's driving the need to strategically collaborate? And for me in my practice, it's really been not just the movement from Medicaid fee-for-service or traditional fee-for-service payment methodologies to managed care payment methodologies, but even within that transition, a movement from volume fee-for-service reimbursement to value, more population health strategies where you're awarded more on outcomes and following process than you are simply just providing a service at greater volume than you provided it yesterday. And given the need to both enter into these value-based methodologies, there's a lot of operational constraints put on smaller organizations who need a lot of infrastructure and resource in order to get to a point where they can participate successfully in value-based healthcare initiatives. And that's really the last point here, which is successful providers really are needing to adapt into the atmosphere because either building scale alone is not going to be sufficient and certainly not the status quo. Just to discuss both on the federal side and the state side what reimbursement changes we're seeing. Dating back to the enactment of the ACA in 2010, accountable care organization programs, whether based on a shared savings initiative or a bundled payment where you're being paid a bundled rate for an entire episode of care. These are two ways that the federal Medicare system is moving away from fee-for-service to more accountable or population health strategy. That was for physicians doubled down through the enactment of MACRA in 2015, where especially physicians are essentially encouraged to, through enhances in the Medicare physician fee schedule, to participate in various alternative payment methodologies or value-based payment programs. And then CMS has espoused a mandate which has yet to change, where they really anticipate 50% of their payments to go through these alternative payment methodologies, non-fee-for-service, more of a population health, and that at least 90% of all of their payments on a for-service basis are going to be tied to actually reported clinical indicators that tie to quality. So what that means is you need to make sure that your reporting and your data infrastructures are really good to preserve even level of reimbursement you have today. So on the federal side, a lot of changes are driving the need for smaller providers to quote-unquote scale up. True on the state side. The key term here has been DIP and the MRT waiver, as it's called, which is the reinvestment in the delivery system reform associated with the with Medicaid populations. The overarching goal to reduce inpatient hospitalizations by 25% by the time the waiver expires in 2019 has been extended to 2021, and to help stabilize the state safety net, the creation of PPSs, which I'm sure a lot of your organizations currently participate in. But in addition to that phase one, which is the creation of a clinical delivery system improvement project through PPSs, to really what's phase two, which is that Medicaid fee-for-service is now mandated not just through managed care, but such that most of the managed care payment relationships are going to be in some form of level 1 or level 2 value-based payment methodology, which is either an upside shared savings methodology, but more commonly, and where the mandate really takes to heart, is that there's going to be some downside risk in your payment relationships with managed care plans, such that you're held financially accountable for your performance, which is not just tied to volume, but improvement in quality, lowering cost, other measures of quality that will be tied to your managed care contracts, which are A, hard to negotiate and complicated to negotiate, but do require a significant underlying infrastructure to ensure that you have the data collection, data analytics, and data reporting capabilities to perform successfully in these value-based payment arrangements. This is one of my favorite slides that I share with in the course of presentations, which is this overarching change in the reimbursement landscape requires a tremendous amount of movement within all organizations of any size. One, you need to know how you're improving quality. I think every organization has a sense of whether they're a quality provider and I hope a high-quality provider, but you need to ensure that you have guidelines, coordination, and documentation that really reflects best clinical practices, because that's how you're going to be paid. You want to understand your cost structure so you can achieve performance against global benchmarks or individual patient benchmarks, which are often the measure of performance under these new managed care contracts. You want to know how you can engage patients or service recipients around clinical decision-making, which requires connectivity. You want to have an understanding of complex program measurements against which you are being rewarded for the value of your care. That is hard. That requires skills and experience and expertise that a lot of organizations don't have internally, nor can afford through an outside consulting firm. And otherwise, IT infrastructure, data reporting, data collection, essential in a value-based payment world. Those expensive investments, especially for smaller healthcare entities, and they require oftentimes connectivity with the systems of other providers or payers. You want to understand the law. That's kind of where I come in, right, to knowing how these value-based payment arrangements affect things like the kickback statute or Medicaid reimbursement or state prohibitions on fee splitting or antitrust, which are all relevant regulatory considerations when you move into these structures. And that, all of these structures reflect that their value in collaborating with a network of partners. Unless you're a large integrated single entity, like a large health system, you are you are one provider, one legal entity, and you need to develop those connectivities both horizontally but also vertically throughout the spectrum of care to allow you to participate collaboratively and meaningfully in value-based payment initiatives. And so this is, really a summation of why these partnerships and collaborations are essential, right? You need access to clinical resources, not just internally but externally. You need access to not just those clinical, but operational, strategic, and management decision-making capabilities. Who really understands where the state is going, or the feds or federal government is going? How do we respond to it? What are our peer organizations doing? That type of collaboration is essential to knowing how to position your organization. Access to capital is essential in terms of funding those IT investments, funding those consulting costs, some available to the state through BHCC and other dollars, but knowing where those capital dollars lie is really important. And then the size, safety in numbers throughout value-based payment, whether because you're negotiating more effectively as part of a larger group consistent with regulatory principles, being able to scale purchasing decisions, to provide turnkey networks to managed care payers. The bigger you are, the more weight and ability you're going to have to innovate in a managed care and value-based payment world. So in light of that introduction, how do you start? That's really, and from where you start to where you select your partner and have an MOU is really an essential decision-making process. So we've broken that out into 4 subsets. The need to get organized, the a need to identify and do some internal work to isolate your organizational goals, to really describe your value proposition. What does your organization bring to the table? Strategic collaboration, and then to engage in the appropriate process to identify and assess who you may be partnering with. We'll go through each of these principles in a bit more detail now. Organized. The overarching principles is that you need to be transparent to your organization. There should be predictability with the process, and you want to do this efficiently. You don't want to spin your wheels. The first thing I like to say to my clients is tell me who your strategy team is, and it should be a combination of typically 4 groups of individuals. Management, you want the strategy team to be all levels of the organization. You want it to be, your senior leaders who really understand what the organization does. You want to involve members of your board or your governing body who have the fiduciary duty of the organization to steer the organization in the right direction. The management governance discussion is absolutely critical. And it's not practical to utilize full board meetings for these discussions. I recommend formation of ad hoc committees, which are usually permitted by corporate bylaws, of 3 directors to be a check and sounding board and really deliver insight and direction through the process. A plug for me, attorneys are usually part of the process, both from a structural and due diligence perspective, but we have a lot of good practical benchmarking experience in terms of how these partnerships are done. And consultants and advisors, depending on the nature of the collaboration, you may need an investment bank, you may need other policy advisors, people who can help you assess the landscape and understand the market. And there's any number of colors and flavors to consultant advisors you can select, and oftentimes management and the board and sometimes the attorneys have opinions as to, depending on what your ideas are, who the best consultant and advisor may be. The next step is to figure out what timeline you're working on. How quickly do you need this to happen? When do board meetings fly out? So to the extent you're planning for a board meeting 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 months hence, when that's going to occur, so you're all staying on track and things don't get easily bumped. And make sure that in your planning document, you're allocating the right responsibilities to that strategy team, right? What's an attorney role, what's a consultant role, what's a board role, what's a management role. And having that mapped out, which is essentially blessed by the board at the top, is really essential to staying organized and making sure your process remains on track. The next is to identify your organizational goals. And this is really, I call this like a board retreat kind of discussion, right? You need to sequester yourself in a room and say to yourself, what makes us special? And what do we need in any strategic partnership that's going to return the value to my organization that I needed to return? And part of that is, do we want to exist as an independent entity, or do we want to really merge or get folded into another organization and cease our own independent existence? The first question I like to ask clients here is, what's your must-haves, right? Like, what are the things you're looking to achieve in partnership? Is it an ROI and a financial investment, right? So you want to return for a capital investor if you're a for-profit. If you're not-for-profit, those discussions really center around continuing the mission of your organization and protecting the community. So you're a safety net provider to ensure that your community still receives the same level of support or better support than it receives today. You're not destroying the social safety net by getting out of the business as an independent organization. The next question, which I've touched on, is how much autonomy do you hope to maintain? Do you want to continue as an independent organization with your own board? Do you want to get folded into another entity? Is there a management transition plan or a succession plan, or do you not have one, so you really can't continue existing as your own entity? That's a huge decision that's going to be factor by factor, very specific by each organization. What are your reasons and your goals for pursuing the collaboration, your clinical programs and outcomes? What do you really need to achieve success under what you're looking to achieve? If it's value-based payment, do you need clinical help? Do you need IT help? Do you need financial help? Understanding what you need to accomplish your goals so you can ask for the right thing is critical. Relatedly, what are the arrangements, value-based, that you're looking to pursue? How important is it to really be merged into an entity so you can have a common managed care rate structure versus, can you pursue an IPA that's more independent but maybe will not get you the same level of managed care participation that you need as an organization? And what, is it managerial and operational that you need in order to pursue your initiative? So is it, again, an IT system? Is it, better strategic leadership? Again, that's going to, that organizational goal, that organizational need is going to drive how you approach a partnership with another organization or group of organizations. The next thing is to identify your organizational value, right? What makes you unique and special? What makes you an attractive partner in a strategic partnership or a strategic affiliation? Do you have good return on investment? Are you a profitable entity? Do you have unique access to a demographic or a service area base? Do you have a lot of potential good alignment in terms of complementary service offerings with partners in your area? Are you uniquely positioned with respect to a specific clinical or program, right? Are you a really great drug treatment provider? Are you a really great ACT provider? Do you fill a niche? Really great leadership, so that your CEO, CFO, COO are attractive to a lot of organizations where they want that talent for another organization. Is your board really strong? Are they supportive of the organization? Are they good donors, such that those community leaders, to the extent you can port them over in a model, is really important. And often what comes up a lot is your brand and the community awareness of your organization. I've done transactions and partnerships that are based not just on financial performance, but on the perception that a specific organization is really high quality, been around a long time, or has a really good reputation in a specific market. That brand and community awareness can be a very strong value proposition in approaching a partnership. And then assessing potential partners is the next preliminary step. Really, for each potential partner, you want to keep in mind your organizational goals and assess your potential partners on the following criteria, right? Your geographic complement. Are they in the same area? Are they in a contiguous area such that you can offer a more comprehensive service? Do you have the operational resources or the management efficiencies that are going to provide the value you're looking for? Are they the same type of quality? Can you increase their quality? Can they increase your quality? They have a leadership and governance team that you believe in. They're committed to the organization, the services that you deliver. Are they financially strong? They have good brand recognition, and really, I think most importantly, culturally, do you come from the same cultural mindset, right? A not-for-profit, for-profit merger tends to get very difficult because you approach clinical decision-making from a different financial viewpoint. Oftentimes, historically religious-sponsored organizations get into this a bit, where can a Catholic-sponsored health system and a Jewish-sponsored health system really partner well, or will the religious directives get in the way? Those cultural and mission-related questions are probably the most fuzzy, but oftentimes the most important. And then, so once you've done that process, determining the model of strategic collaboration is essential, and this goes to the autonomy that you're going to have with as an independent entity versus as a merged or folded-in entity to another organization. And we like to, I've often presented this graphic on slide 21 that really shows the spectrum of how you can pursue collaborative models with different partners. On the left side, we have a low level of integration, which may inhibit your ability to achieve those overarching goals, but you preserve the greatest degree of autonomy within your organization, right? So we're say affiliation agreement or management services agreement, and even joint operating agreement. Those are just contractual affiliations. There's a preservation of autonomy. There's maintenance of separate governance systems, separate leadership, but you're collaborating around specific programs and initiatives, whether through an IPA or a clinical collaboration, or sharing through management services agreements, some back-end operational expertise, whether it's HR and IT. You can pursue those on a clinical initiative while preserving your autonomy. That may be enough. A joint venture is in the middle. That's where we form a new entity, and you have like a 50-50 contribution to the new entity, and that joint venture essentially is the new vehicle through which you pursue the initiatives you want to pursue, but really with shared governance, shared responsibility at different levels. And as you get to membership substitution, merger, asset acquisition, those are the transaction types that really merge or one entity ceases to exist. So you're essentially yourself, you're moving into another entity, or you're getting a new corporate parent that's going to be able to rule the roost in terms of all of the major governance decision making. So where you fall on this line and on the spectrum is really based on that prior organizational planning process, but it's critical to know how integrated do we have to be to achieve our objectives, and how much local control, how much individual autonomy as an organization do we want to retain through our strategic collaboration. Business and regulatory considerations to making that decision. There could be tax, and this is where the lawyers really get in to analyze the specific options, but tax considerations, right? Are you going to have, is it a for-profit, not-for-profit merger, which may create some significant tax liabilities, or a not-for-profit conversion? Is there a purchase price? How's that going to be allocated to the owners and the members? If you need capital, that has, it's harder to get capital without ceasing to have autonomy. And then, again, retention of autonomy, whether you really believe you need to continue as an independent organization to achieve your goals or to preserve your community mission. Different models of strategic collaboration are going to have different impacts on whether the state gets involved in approval of the transaction from a licensure or attorney general approval standpoint. And that could, given the desire to submit to the regulators, may be a reason to do a transaction or not do a transaction in a specific form. There's different implications under the Stark Law and a kickback statute in terms of how business gets referred to the different entities, and whether if you preserve autonomy and you start making clinical referrals, whether those are protected under these laws that can criminalize or make or create civil liability for inappropriate referral making. And then we discussed in terms of licensure control, but minimizing or submitting to state approval and what that may mean from your licensure really has a huge impact, and especially in New York State, where the certificate of need process is so rigorous, it's a major consideration that you have to think about. Jump in a bit more detail on that CON point. Depending on your provider type, you're going to have to submit to different certificates of need or regulatory approval processes, right? The Article 28 side for hospitals and DNTCs and nursing homes, Article 36 for home care providers, Article 40 for hospice. These all have different approval requirements that can take 6 months to a year. And so if you need to move quickly, you may not decide to do a merger or a membership substitution that would trigger a specific type of licensure. And knowing the process and timeframes associated with each of these approval processes can help at the earliest position whether and how to pursue a specific merger. I can't tell you how many times a client's called me deciding on a merger, and they say, we really want to do a merger. And I said, well, do you have a year? And they're like, no. And I was like, well, you can't do a merger. Or, do you want this to be public, right, because you have to submit it to the Attorney General on a docket that gets approved by the New York State Supreme Court? Is that something you want to engage in? They say no, and that takes a whole bunch of transaction types off these. So oftentimes the CON or regulatory approval process can help dictate the appropriate affiliation model. Whether to pursue looser affiliation models is often driven by a desire to preserve autonomy. And we discussed these a bit. The most common I've seen of late, especially for organizations that want to retain autonomy, is a contractual affiliation. And you probably heard this a lot, but the IPA model, something I've done a lot of in the last 4 years, which is an IPA being an association of providers, typically done through a legal entity, where each entity has either an ownership stake, but at least a contractual stake in furthering the goals of the IPA. And an IPA is a special vehicle that can engage in managed care contracting on behalf of providers without violating New York's restriction on the corporate practice of medicine. And so an IPA is a very flexible contractual affiliation model that can achieve a lot of objectives while preserving autonomy. The lowest form of, and I don't mean low in terms of thinking about my opinion of it, I think it's a very valuable thing, but it's sort of the least committed form of collaboration or partnership that you can have with other independent providers in your provider type or geography that can achieve the goals of value-based payment without losing your separate corporate existence. Management services agreement, again, this is where you contract out certain management roles, back-end office, to help, preserve and build efficiencies so that you're not duplicating sort of multiple HR systems, multiple IT systems. Joint operating and joint ventures, these are of the same ilk, but you're essentially creating a new structure that's a legal entity where you have real financial and governance stakes to pursue your collaborative initiatives. We really discussed the considerations on the prior slide, but again, control autonomy is going to be the primary one. How much do you want to have a stake in your future outcome or preserve your independence as an organization with your separate board and your separate direction? Is this one thing you're doing, or is this everything you're doing? And that's a real, that goes back to the first part of the presentation, your strategic decision-making process and knowing what, what you really need and what you can continue as a separate organization, or whether you can do this through a lighter form of contractual affiliation. And then we have what are more of the integrated models, which we discussed. A membership substitution is where you get a new corporate parent that has reserved powers and major decision-making, usually to a point remove the subsidiary board. Merger and consolidation, probably familiar terms, but where one entity or two entities merge together, one entity ceases to exist, or a new entity is formed. An asset acquisition is essentially sell yourself or another organization sold to you for some bona fide consideration. You've acquired the assets, not the liabilities, but the other organization remains a shell and ceases to exist. Considerations regarding approval. Now that we've gone through quite quickly, the planning and the internal organizational ducks you have to have in order to pursue an affiliation, a menu of strategic collaboration models and the trade-offs for each one in terms of autonomy, regulatory approvals, and regulatory liability. The next step is really get to consensus with your potential partner. And you don't have to engage in the stage of a memorandum of understanding, but it's something as a lawyer who's done a lot of these deals, I fully recommend. And I say MOU, people also call it, and the actual documents look a bit different, but they're all getting to the same point. You can call it a letter of intent, you can call it a term sheet, but this is a preliminary document that's binding. It's typically mostly non-binding, but with limited binding provisions, where you agree with your potential partner on what your partnership or collaboration is going to look like. And again, you don't have to do an MOU. You jump right to the final definitive agreement or agreements that are going to memorialize the collaboration and transaction. But I can't stress enough, and if you take away nothing else from this presentation, know that developing this interim MOU document is tremendously valuable to the planning process, both from knowing that you have meaningful agreement with your potential partner, so to build consensus within your organization and within your governance structure, that everyone's in agreement on pursuing the due diligence and agreement drafting and negotiation that's incumbent upon the final agreement. So that interim step is, to me, really critical. And knowing when you want to develop and sign an MOU is a heavily strategic one, and one that you can either do too late or too early in the process, and that can harm your chances for success. Most of the provisions, as I said, in an MOU are non-binding. Agreement on principles, agreement on what you pursue the structure to be. But then there are certain binding provisions you want to include. The term, so how long you want the MOU to be outstanding for, essentially the time frame you have to reach agreement. The confidentiality, you can either have this in a separate confidentiality agreement or non-disclosure agreement, but sometimes I like to bake it in to MOU so all of your binding agreements are in one place. The biggest consideration is exclusivity. When you sign an MOU, typically you'll want to become exclusive with your potential partner. You want to limit your ability to negotiate deals with third parties that aren't in that negotiation already. And so that ties you together for purposes of making a deal happen. And if you're not exclusive, there really isn't much to, reaching agreement on the preliminary points as part of the MOU. You're giving yourself a time, whether it's 1 month or whether it's, a year, to get to a point where you're reaching consensus and agreement and signing full binding documents and submitting to the regulatory approval process. Coverage of costs, who's incurring what expenses and diligence? Do people pay their own? Do the parties pay their own costs? Or sometimes you'll see the larger buying party in a more full affiliation pay some of the costs of the smaller provider or the smaller organization who's selling themselves to the larger organization, negotiating that because both parties will incur costs in pursuing the affiliation for the consultants, advisors, and lawyers in getting this done, and understanding whether this is going to be governed by New York law or another jurisdiction. If you have in-state deals, that's actually a pretty sticky point. Non-business, as I mentioned, will include structural terms, right? What the parties want in terms of the type of affiliation, regulatory approval are contemplated, what the post-closing board or governance structure may look like. There's a host of non-binding provisions, which really are delineated on the next slide. Over here. So these are really, again, a list of the non-binding terms. Transaction structure, right? So looking back to the prior slides in terms of different affiliation models, which one are you choosing? And whether if something doesn't happen at a certain time, can we break the MOU off so, you really hold the parties' feet to the fire to get a deal done in the time frame you need it to get done. What the post-closing governance structure is going to be, who's on the board, whether, if it's a membership substitution, whether the parent board will have reserve powers, whether there's a multi-phase process, and this is very typical in larger hospital transactions. You may start with a membership substitution where one hospital becomes the corporate of another hospital, but within a period of time, say 3 to 5 years, the hospitals say we're going to work towards a full asset merger. And so whether you want to sort of phase out the level of integration over time, it doesn't have to be all or nothing and all at once. You want to memorialize what the anticipated purchase price is going to be, or other capital commitments. This is a critical point. So in a traditional sale transaction, there may be, say, okay, we're going to pay you $10 million for your organization. That may or may not be appropriate, but oftentimes in the not-for-profit context, the consideration is not so much transaction value, but it's to say, we're going to fix these program locations for you, or we're going to jointly develop a new clinic. And those commitments are non-financial. They're usually capital-oriented, and that could be the consideration that you're getting for purposes of entering into the affiliation. Management employees, this is often critical. What's the post-affiliation management team going to look like? Which are you committing to employ or retain certain individuals as part of the transaction? That's a big sticking point you want to address in an MOU. And what are your other post-closing commitments? And I want to relate back to that must-haves discussion that we addressed on the earlier slide in terms of organizational planning. But as I discussed there, you're working through a strategic planning process what you need as an organization to preserve your community and your community commitment, your mission. So those things you want to include in your MOU to say, this is why I'm doing the deal, and this is the commitment I need from the organization with which partnering to get the deal done. And another big ticket item for negotiating the MOU is, what do we really have to include in the MOU versus what should we be waiting for the definitive agreement? This is where the real strategy comes in, and I often lament how I do things in the course of various transactions because things didn't go as well as I wanted to, and hey, did we lose such leverage by including something in the MOU versus waiting to negotiate it? But as an overarching matter, if you're a seller, right? If you're an organization that's merging into another organization or ceasing to exist, or you're the smaller provider joining a larger provider, use your leverage once an MOU is signed that has exclusivity. So when you've tied yourself to a deal or affiliation model and you're exclusive for a period of time under the binding provisions of the MOU, you immediately lose that ability to negotiate those points. You want to resolve the major issues up front to save the time and the uncertainty and to know that you have a commitment to proceed. But you don't want to agree to things too early because although MOUs are non-binding, I've had deals break down when parties try and say, oh, yeah, I know we agreed to it in the MOU, but really rethinking that now. The parties start to lose credibility and trust in each other, then break down. So knowing when to memorialize what when is an incredibly difficult strategic decision as part of any transaction. And so you want to balance those desires for certainty on the structure, but then you also want to you don't want to give away the ship too soon. Then the other major consideration is when to decide to include the purchase price and capital commitments in the MOU. I think that these are really important things to include, right? The value that you're getting out is the value proposition for doing the deal in the first place, but there are also inherent limitations, right? Sometimes you need to do a valuation to ensure that a purchase price is consistent with fair market value or will exceed, the purchase will exceed the asset calculation of the company. If you haven't done, a lot of boards and companies will do an auction where they'll send out an RFP, a request for proposals, and test different affiliation partners. And it's hard to commit to an MOU with a specific partner without doing that bid process to see whether you've really gotten the best return on a potential partnership. And there's a lot of case law in New York and other jurisdictions that boards have a fiduciary duty of care and loyalty to explore the best transaction or affiliation for their organization. And if you're committing too soon to one preferred or potential partner, how do you know you've really gotten the best deal? And so a lot of the decision-making process out there is, do we do an RFP, or do we know that based on what this party is willing, we're not going to get something better by taking the time and expense of doing that broad-based solicitation? And, as part of the MOU, assessing what an organization is really getting that's beyond just the financial consideration. Commitment, it could be, a desire to explore a potential strategic initiative that's inherently non-financial. It could be the fact that they're willing to give you 30 or 40 or 50% of the board so that you appoint your legacy trustees or directors to that board and you preserve your community mission or your organizational mission as part of that new organization. These are all really hard, complicated, intensive decisions by a board and management that require both strategy but also an understanding of the framework and context in which you're making those decisions. Once you've signed the MOU, and this is part of the next presentation, you'll typically engage in full due diligence. Sometimes parties will engage in minimal due diligence to get to MOU with a plan for more extensive due diligence to get from the MOU to the definitive agreement. There's also some decisions too that once you sign the MOU, you're still separate organizations. Oftentimes, you're still competitors, and so if you're collaborating and sharing managed care rate information, for example, that could be an antitrust problem. And so, you want to make sure when you're proceeding both as part of the MOU and after the MOU that you're aware of the regulatory limitations on sharing data, collaborating, because you still, depending on the type of collaboration, you're still going to remain competitors. And we put in this term, which is probably one many of you have heard, but you can't gun jump. And so you can't start announcing your collaboration and your partnership or your strategic affiliation without actually having done it. And so if you, for example, approach a managed care plan, say we're all but merged, right? that's gun jumping, and there are laws that prohibit it, both from a consumer protection standpoint, but also from an antitrust standpoint. And you want to be really clear as to when you announce the affiliation, when you start acting on the affiliation, and so that's critical. So that's really it. I wanted to end about 10 to 15 minutes early, so we could save some time for presentations. For questions on what's a very weighty subject matter. And I know I've seen a few chats come across, and maybe I'll kick it back over to Daniela to moderate those questions and save some time for some more if others come across. So I think
thank you, Brett. Yeah. So yes, you've definitely given us a lot of information and a whole lot to consider. We've already got some questions that came in, and I do want to encourage folks again to this time to chat in your questions. So the first question is from someone who's interested in systems, IPAs, and others partnering with small independent primary care practices, so basically small for-profit businesses, to provide them with the infrastructure they need to serve as medical homes and to participate in VBP. Can you offer any insight to this, Frieder?
Yes. So this is. Oh, sorry. Yep. Does anyone want to clarify further on that before I jump in?
I think that's all we've got from this one.
Okay. So this is probably one of the most typical affiliation models I've seen in my practice, which is use of an IPA model for independent for-profit physician groups as a way to pool resources, share best practices, and participate meaningfully in value-based payment initiatives. And for the it's very common because physician practices in this day and age have especially smaller independent groups of onesies, twosies, even foursies and fivesies, don't have the capacity and the infrastructure to do a lot, or to invest in the resources necessary to participate meaningfully in value-based payment. One option, which is sell themselves, right? Sell themselves to a large integrated practice or to a health system, which is the route a lot of smaller physician practices have gone. But the other route, which is what we touched on in the presentation, but it's the IPA model. And this is where a new entity designated as an IPA is formed. Typically, physician practices make financial contributions in exchange for ownership of the IPA, but also used to participate in the IPA. And the IPA becomes a place where those resources are pooled, and the IPA can make investments on behalf of its physician members to participate, in whether it's the IT infrastructure, whether it's the strategic advice, whether it's managed care negotiations, to assess, analyze, and negotiate different value-based payment opportunities. In IPA model, it's on the left side of that scale, and I'll cycle back to the slide just because it's a helpful teach tool. But you're in an IPA model, you're sort of all the way on the left, where in the affiliation agreement, right, there's a pure preservation of practice autonomy, right? The physicians still remain owners of their own practices or employees of their own practices, but a lot of decisions now are being centralized through the IPA as around what's typically referred to as clinical or financial integration. Is the process of developing common clinical care protocols you believe will set you up for success in value-based payment, being able to submit and analyze data that determines whether those protocols are successful at lowering cost and improving health outcomes, and then being able to participate meaningfully in value-based payment contracts. There could be care management within an IPA. There's often, a CEO or an executive management, and then, someone familiar with the managed care negotiation process. The critical limitation on IPAs is that the practice entities remain separate and competing organizations. And so there's inherent limitations under antitrust law that limits the type of information, especially managed care rate information, that can be among and freely among the different physicians in an IPA. And unless you're pursuing a rate-based contract, which counts financial integration, or you're meaningfully and sufficiently clinically integrated, the IPA can't contract on behalf of all of the physicians in the aggregate. something that's called a messenger model, where physicians are still agreeing to their individual managed care rates with each managed care plan. And so that autonomy can hurt your ultimate objectives, because you're not going to, as I hear from my clients, you're not going to get that rate bump automatically just by joining the IPA. Often a lot of work by the physicians to achieve meaningful clinical integration to success in the value-based payment, but it's the best alternative to selling yourself or ceasing to exist as your own physician owner, because the IPA preserves your practice autonomy and allows you to use the IPA to pursue a lot of the clinical and financial initiatives that are incumbent upon the success in the value-based payment world. Separate presentations on IPAs, it's probably the most common affiliation model I'm seeing in this day and age, not just within physician practices, but within all sorts of provider types, whether it's substance use disorder, mental health, behavioral health, increasingly intellectual and developmental disabilities. Every traditional Medicaid provider type, as they transition from fee-for-service to a managed care world, is thinking about the IPA model potentially as step or the only step in pursuing this type of strategic collaboration.
Hey, thanks, Brett. We've got some more questions that came in. This one is, excuse me, CBOs and peer service provider organizations who receive government funding and need to do some data reporting for some of their grants. So they're wondering if you can share on how small peer programs might enter into an agreement with a managed care organization or a BHO where the only need would be data sharing, and if you could speak a little bit about what type of agreement would be best for this type of organization and if there are any related approvals that are needed.
Yes, so that's a very good question, because if it's really limited to data sharing and grant reporting, the organization through which you're doing that type of shared collaboration, you think of less as a holistic strategic collaborator, but really a service provider. Look at the spectrum on slide 21. That's really the management services agreement option. Right, you have organizations that are trying to pool their resources, create data connectivity, and then report data out to meet the requirements of certain grant contracts. Prominently, what that centralized organization is doing is receiving the data, accessing the data, extracting the data, and reporting the data. And that could be done, as part of an IPA or a large strategic initiative. But if you're looking to just that limited role, that's possible, but the primary consideration is the use HIPAA and privacy to ensure that when you transfer the data to a third party, which is what's being involved here, you're doing it consistent with the parameters of HIPAA, 42 CFR Part 2 if you're a treatment provider, and then Mental Hygiene Law 3313 if you're a behavioral health or other provider subject to that to the statute. Lots of limitations and reasons for which you can provide the data, share it, and report it, which really the context of a whole other presentation. But data use and establishing the right agreements is going to be essential to in that collaborative initiative. The primary agreements would be traditionally. You think of that reporting entity as a business associate of the covered entities that are sharing the data, and they're providing a service pursuant to that business associate role, consistent with the permissions and authorizations given by the covered entity. And then the covered entities, which are the organizations that generate the data and provide the services, need to ensure that the business associate is complying with obligations and keeping the data secure. And there's typically a service fee that's going to be charged by that sort of data crunching entity to each of the providers. So it really falls. I would say it's on the left side of the spectrum, right? High degree of autonomy control. You're really subcontracting out for a specific management service related to data reporting, and you need to make sure that your transmission of data is secure, it's protected, it's consistent with a valid purpose for use of the data under various federal and state law. and that data is protected and returned if necessary. A lot of, yeah.
Oh, thanks. All right, we've got one more question here that is actually related to something that you mentioned in one of your last slides. They're wondering if you could elaborate on the non-financial value for nonprofits that you had mentioned in one of the last slides of your presentation.
Happy to. That's it's one of my favorite topics because oftentimes this is where the rubber hits the road in terms of assessing the view of a potential collaboration. Non-financial consideration comes in many forms, right? Sort of the sky is the limit in terms of the value you can get from different commitments made by a collaborating partner or a potential acquirer of your organization. I would say most typical that we see is one, a role on the future board of the governing entity. So, are they going to give certain board seats to board members of your provider? With the idea that those legacy directors, those legacy trustees, are going to carry the mission and culture of your organization to the board of the new organization. That's sort of a baseline expectation in these transactions. The second is, I'll call it brand preservation. So, use of name, we've clearly acquired, established and perfected the meaning of our entity name over time. And so if we're affiliating, merging, selling to you, are you going to preserve the name either on our legacy sites? Is there going to be a new name that reflects, some combination? These branding and naming discussions often be, despite the fact that they feel in some ways very soft, often have a lot of meaning to to the constituents to ensure that what made that prior organization special is going to be carried forward in some way to the new collaboration, the new organization. Third thing I see in terms of non-financial consideration is commitment to program preservation or program growth. So if there's a specific center of excellence or program of excellence that the selling or sort of affiliating provider has a commitment that's as definitive as you can make it, that the acquiring entity is not going to touch the program or they're going to grow the program to ensure that it continues in its way, shape, or form. And that could be a program, it could be a location, it could be a community commitment. It could be a commitment to like a model of care. So if you have a specific way that your organization does something that you feel is really special, oftentimes I see, in the drug treatment world, like the commitment to medical assisted treatment or medication assisted treatment, right? That's a philosophical issue around how drug treatment occurs, and if the acquiring provider is committing to being aligned on that philosophy and not changing that philosophy without the approval of the legacy directors on the board, that ensures that you're really selling to an organization that's going to be holistically and philosophically aligned going forward. Really the big items, but you can really have any number of things. I guess the last big one too, just thinking through, is employment commitment. It's sort of quasi-financial because agreeing to employ people has a direct financial commitment to it. But if there's going to be retention of programmatic leadership of certain key people within quality or really programmatic operations, and knowing that those people are going to retain their roles and retain a job, and the services are going to be provided under the leadership and direction of those individuals, that's a really big ask in course of these MOUs, and figuring out which people are going to stay and which people can go. It's not tied directly to the purchase price, so I sort of put that in the non-financial bucket, because it's often the hardest to conceptualize.
So much, Brett. I don't want to cut you off, but I do know that it's 1 o'clock, and I know you've got some other appointments in your calendar today. So I want to thank you so much for coming on and talking with us today and answering questions. There's one other question that we didn't get to, and hopefully we know who sent it in so that we can respond to that question by email. I want to remind folks again, one last effort to register for our March 1st webinar, which will be part 2 of this collaboration series, and we'll take a deeper dive into strategy and due diligence on that webinar. So, and thanks so much, Brett. Have a great day, everyone.
Excellent. Thank you.